Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm the Reverend William Levwood, the minister here at Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. It's so good to be with you this morning. As we begin our service, I invite you to silence your phones if you're in person. Take a deep breath and center yourself for worship. We open and welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land who live on in their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Patawomic Indian tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move toward healing so that all together shall one day know full justice.
Welcome to Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm Christina Watts, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm happy to be your worship associate today. This congregation is a welcoming and inclusive community that seeks to create a more just and compassionate world. If you're new to Accotink and would like to talk more about this church, just about anyone here can tell you about us. Our greeters, our minister, myself, or anyone with a cross-stitched name tag, which I forgot today. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, we encourage you to stay for our social hour online and in person immediately after the service. We're so delighted for you that you've decided to join us today. Welcome.
Our theme this month is vulnerability, and I want to share some of what was shared in the chat about what makes it possible to be vulnerable. Michelle Anderson says, trusting that those who hear me will be understanding. And Kate McDevitt shared, I feel like it's possible for me to be vulnerable to someone who is open to listening and caring. So this week, we're going to look at what it means to explore vulnerability in our relationships with each other and with ourselves. Next, we're going to explore friendship as a container for deepening together and also celebrate the cherry blossoms. They won't be in peak bloom quite yet, but they are blossoming early this year. And then the following Sunday, we're going to look at blues music and see what that might teach us about vulnerability. And then finally, the last Sunday of the month, we'll celebrate Transgender Day of Visibility and see what that has to teach us about vulnerability as well and making safe spaces and brave spaces for each other. What's this? Do we have the Wonder Box here again?
We have the Wonder Box again. Gosh.
What could be in the Wonder Box this morning?
Wow. This is Monkey. And Monkey is very special to me because Monkey is very special to someone that I love. So Monkey is actually 50 years old and belongs to my fiance, Mike. And Monkey's had his mouth redone, his nose, his eyes, and he's been incredibly loved for a very long time and still in our home.
So I want to share a story about Maddie. And Maddie had something like Monkey in her life. It was a blanket, actually, that she'd had since she was an infant. It also had to be repaired. And she was invited to a sleepover. And she really wanted to bring Maddie, but she was at that age where she started to wonder if other people would judge her for bringing that blanket to the sleepover. So she went to the sleepover, and they started watching a movie. And the mother who was hosting the sleepover had been given a heads up about this, and she kind of noticed that Maddie was having an internal dialogue where she was like, I want my blankie, but I also am worried about what people are going to think about that. But then she got up the courage and she went and she got her blankie. And one of the other children looked at her and said, "What's that?" She kind of took a deep breath and she said, "Well, this is my blankie and it was given to me by a family friend and I have loved it and it's comforted me. I've taken it on vacations with me, slept with it in strange hotels. I've held it when I needed extra support." And then a really magical thing happened. All the other children, to a person, went to their bags and pulled out a teddy bear or a blanket or a little monkey, tattered and worn. And they all sat down together and told the stories of these special objects that were so important to them. I think it's important to remember that when it comes to being vulnerable, it can be hard. It can be hard to share that we are vulnerable, right? That we need a security blanket. But also, it's okay to have a security blanket. In a lot of religious traditions, I think you could say that there are security blankets of a sort. Rosaries, beads that Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims use to say prayers. And also we can be security blankets for each other, right? Like all those children were for each other in our story. So we're happy to have Monkey with us today to remind us that it's good to be vulnerable, it's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to share that with others.
Our reading today is called Kindness by Naomi Shihab Nye. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel there where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out to the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend.
Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh has a book called No Mud, No Lotus. This is a common image in Buddhism to describe that it's necessary to open to suffering in order to develop insight and understanding, in order to be compassionate and loving. He says in that book that when we stop the busyness of the mind and come back to ourselves, the enormity and rawness of our suffering can seem very intense because we're so used to ignoring it and distracting ourselves. There's a danger that we can be quickly overwhelmed by it. He says that our suffering needs to be held with tenderness. He actually says cradled with tenderness, which is why I brought Monkey up here, so that we can have an image of cradling our suffering. You cradle your suffering with tenderness by just being with it non-judgmentally, just as you would with an infant in your arms. And even before our awareness brings us any understanding about our suffering, just that act of mindfulness, of cradling with tenderness our suffering, already brings some relief, just like a security blanket. Thich Nhat Hanh writes that the more we develop capacity for empathy, understanding, and compassion, the more we can turn our suffering into compost that becomes a flower garden. When we take care of and look deeply into our sorrow, it can transform into that understanding and compassion and create a loop. No mud, no lotus, no compost garden, no compost, no flower garden, no suffering, no understanding and compassion. Now, I imagine that some of you have heard the phrase, hurt people hurt people. This is most true when our suffering is unacknowledged. That's when it's most in danger of overflowing. When we don't practice being with our suffering, when we don't cradle it with tenderness and transform it into understanding and love, which is not an easy thing to do. But there's really no other alternative. Hurt people, that's the alternative. Now, our suffering can come to us in many ways. Our vulnerability can come to us in many ways. Some are unique to our own personal life stories. Your suffering, your vulnerability may be that you've struggled with addiction, or that you struggle with anxiety or depression, or you struggle to be financially secure. Perhaps at some point in your life you've lost a job. Studies show that can be more devastating than losing a spouse. Or maybe you just didn't get a job or an opportunity that you worked hard for. Or maybe you've had other significant losses in your life. Grief, or even grief piled on top of grief. Or you struggle with your sense of self-worth. Or you're having difficulty with aging, losing your ability to do things that you used to be able to do, things that are important to you, the ability to be independent, or just things that gave you joy. Maybe you can even still do them, but not the way that you used to be able to. And then there are vulnerabilities and sufferings and harms and hurts that are scripted for us by society. Brene Brown, who's a social researcher, social scientist who researches shame and vulnerability, says that masculine norms tell us there is nothing worse than being weak. Tell us that we should always be strong, stoic, able to handle a crisis, heroic. And feminine norms tell us there's nothing worse than being less than perfect. Tell us that we should always have it all together, the kids taken care of, the house spotless, hair and makeup just right. Now, whether these hurts, these wounds come from society or from the details of our personal life experience or the stage of life we're at, it can be hard to be with the hurt. As Thich Nhat Hanh says, it can be overwhelming. We need to practice being with our vulnerability. We need to ease into it. We need security blankets and supportive spaces to be vulnerable. Things like the Soul Matters groups that happen here, this community on any given Sunday or any day of the week can be a space like that. You can, and I know that you are that for each other. With or without support, we need to make choices about our vulnerability. Not all places and times are equally safe. Not every relationship can hold us tenderly. You may need to start by telling only part of the story. Maybe to yourself at first. Maybe you just tell part of the story to someone you feel like can be that listening presence that Michelle and Kate McDevitt mentioned earlier. Building up your tolerance to feeling the discomfort, the vulnerability of sharing. Over time, through that sharing, you may nurture more intimacy and care and connection with that person, as together you create a container for cradling each other's suffering and vulnerability. Brené Brown has a term that I think is just a fascinating and powerful way to describe the choice to move into vulnerability. She calls it rumbling. She describes that this practice of moving this is the practice of moving into those difficult places of discomfort, of suffering, of vulnerability. And when we rumble, we ask 3 questions. We ask, what more do I need to understand about this suffering? What more do I need to understand about the other people in this story? And what more do I need to understand about myself? We rumble because we can have a false narrative about our hurt. We can come to the wrong conclusion about what's going on in our life. We can blame someone else. We can shame ourselves. And with each of these mistakes, our hurt can hurt people. It can keep us from loving ourselves well. Our hurt can keep us from loving others well. Our hurt can move us in the wrong direction, distorting how we experience the world. All of these, by the way, can happen at the societal level as well as at the personal level. Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, hatred of immigrants. Each of these is a way that as a society we blame others for the hurt and the suffering in the world. And when we buy into these stories for ourselves, we perpetuate, we turn this in and we take that hateful message of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia onto ourselves. Either we project it out or we project it in if we don't rumble with it. Or we can just have it distort the way we view the world. If we believe the problems in this country stem from immigration, for example, we might miss the real problem. And if we don't know what the real problems are, we can't address them. So whether in our personal lives or with societal harms, we need to practice rumbling. We need to question our assumptions. We need to check in with the story that we're telling ourselves. Now, there are many ways to rumble. Thich Nhat Hanh, as a Buddhist monk, may his memory be for a blessing, he suggests rumbling through meditation, using introspection, the calming nature of focusing on the breath, to rumble with our suffering and come to new understandings that move us towards care and compassion for ourselves and for others. I know many of us, especially Unitarian Universalists, we rumble through study. We read a book, learn more about how the world works. We question our assumptions about ourselves and each other. We learn the ins and outs of the human psyche from science. We bring our own reason to bear on what we study. And we can also rumble in relationships. We can reach out for connection and care and offer acceptance and empathy to each other, helping each other to learn and grow together. Now, I think there's an important thing if we get to the stage of making the choice to rumble that still we often forget. We often forget to show our work. Remember that phrase from math when you were in elementary and middle school? You have to show your work so that you can see where maybe you made a mistake. If you get the answer wrong, you can go back and find where that was. You show your work so that your teacher knows that you knew what you were doing. We need to show our work with our vulnerability as well. Others need to see it, but we have a tendency to hide it because of that shame that we feel. And because we're taught in a culture of mastery that we're supposed to have it already all figured out. But that isn't how the world works, is it? We didn't learn math that way. And thinking that the world works that way only makes us feel more shame, and more shame only makes us try to cover over the suffering. When what we need to do is to practice being with that suffering, being with our vulnerability. When we hide it from others, it not only makes us more isolated, it makes all of us more isolated. We can have the illusion that we're the only one suffering. And we give our loved ones no models, particularly our children. We give our children no models if we don't show our work. In a developmentally appropriate way, of course, but if we don't show our work and then give them a chance to practice being vulnerable themselves, learning from our example and acknowledging, that's a good method for learning, modeling, a little acknowledgement, and the opportunity to practice. MAP. So show your work. Others need to see it. We are all vulnerable, all imperfect. We're all suffering. And vulnerability is there to teach us this, to teach us that we're all vulnerable, imperfect, suffering, to teach us how to connect and care for each other. We all have a yearning, Brene Brown writes, to live a wholehearted life. And then she defines this as engaging in our life from a place of worthiness. She writes, this means cultivating the courage, compassion, and connection to wake up every morning and think no matter what gets done and no matter how much is left undone, I am enough. It's going to bed at night and thinking, yes, I am imperfect and vulnerable and often afraid, but that doesn't change the truth that I am brave and worthy of love and belonging. So show your work, rumble with each other, rumble with yourself, open gently to suffering, and practice being with that vulnerability so that we can care for each other, so that we know that we're not alone. This is how we learn to care for ourselves and for others. This is what opening to vulnerability teaches us. May it be so. May we be among those who make it so. Amen, 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 and blessed be.
As we extinguish this chalice, I invite you to join me now in our community blessing with these words of David Bumbaugh. This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. You join us now in silent witness to that unity.